Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello, my name is David Myers, and I'm your host of this episode of Then and Now. I'm pleased to welcome today a towering figure in the world of social justice activism, the Reverend James Lawson. Reverend Lawson has been one of the most influential and inspirational faith leaders in Los Angeles and the United States at large over the past 7 decades. He is perhaps most renowned as the person who introduced and taught the philosophy of nonviolence to the leadership of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, including to his friend and colleague, Martin Luther King Jr. But Jim Lawson, who is still active and teaching at age 95, has had an impact on many major struggles for justice in this country ever since. Indeed, in recognition of his close partnership and influence at UCLA, it was decided in 2021 to rename the UCLA Labor Center as the UCLA James M. Lawson Jr. Labor Center. In this episode of Then and Now, we will discuss Reverend Lawson's origins and formation as a young man, his exposure to the idea of nonviolence in India and in this country, and his career-long efforts to promote this idea, especially to a world that is convulsing in violence here in the United States, in Ukraine and Russia, and in Israel and Gaza. It is important to hear again the voice of James Lawson. Welcome to Then and Now, Reverend Lawson.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be visiting with you, David, again.
Great. So your father and your grandfather were Methodist ministers. How did you come to this calling, Reverend Lawson? Did you have any choice in the matter?
As I have tried to explore that question, I do maintain I had no choice. My immediate family of my parents and brothers and sisters, siblings, of which there were 12, and Dad had married twice after his first wife died early on. I had no choice. I sensed that from a very early age, I knew that my life was meant to be, and that it was a life in the human species. So I've always been comfortable with myself. In some ways, persecuted, yes. Opposed by racism and then violence, yes. But in all those places of my life where I've tried to live resisting the wrong in our societies and in our world.
So I want to take up this question of what it was like to grow up. What was it like growing up as a young Black kid in Ohio in the 1940s? What did you encounter in terms of racism and prejudice?
Well, I like to say, for an example, that I do not know of a single instance of racism in my life while going to Lauren Andrew Junior High School or Longfellow Junior High School or Washington High School, and all of these being in Massillon, Ohio. I do not remember a single instance of what I would call racism.
How did you become aware of racism?
In education, I should say clearly in education. Now, in Massillon streets, I was aware because it was in the streets and 2 different of our municipal parks that I met overt racism addressed at me or my brothers or a sister of mine. So that's where I heard the harsh words. I, in public education, was able to learn in high school, get a foundation for study and research and for preaching, teaching, being a pastor which was my hope from early on, and to realizing that Jesus of Nazareth was a nonviolent practitioner, though we didn't have that language then. And then emerging, recognizing I was going to be engaged in the process of dismantling the wrong.
Did you have that awareness already in high school, that this was your mission in life?
Yes.
You did.
Yes, I did.
And then after high school, you were drafted into the United States military, and you refused to serve.
Yes.
In fact, you went to jail for it.
Yes. At 18, I registered for the draft, but engaged basically in a non-cooperation stance personally. At that time, laws establishing and promoting racism or the status quo in the United States, I rejected. And then that began in the middle of college for me to begin that my exemptions, I had 4 different exemptions if I want them, as I remember. I didn't apply for any of them because I felt I should not have so many exemptions. And yet the average student, male student in my college year, that had no exemptions. They had an exemption if they kept their grades up and stayed in class. They had an exemption if they were pre-ministerial student or medical student. And there's some others too. But fundamentally, I felt that I had all kinds of options, and I chose in those options non-cooperation with the draft.
And what were the consequences of that non-cooperation?
So, number one, there were no reactions from the court or police. But then as the Korean War began in June of 1950, suddenly my non-cooperation became a violation of the law, and I was arrested. We think it was in August of 1950, because the trial was in May of 1951.
And you were convicted?
Oh, absolutely. I was convicted. I just read a couple of the notes from yesterday or before. I read some of the notes from my journal that is in the Vanderbilt archives. And I took the posture of non-cooperating with selective service pretty seriously, and really didn't do it until probably 4950, when I sent my cards back, because I was cooperating. But of course, in those college years of 47 to 52, I was learning about what I was doing, namely as nonviolence, by reading Gandhi in 1947 and beyond.
And then after you, I think this is the sequence, after you were incarcerated, which you might want to say a word about, you then went to India on a Methodist mission.
That's right.
Where you learned more deeply about the Gandhian notion of nonviolence, satyagraha.
Yes, I had, I think, a thoroughly decent understanding of Gandhi's intervention with what he did call it the science, and he did call it a way of life. He recognized that it was literature from the past in the human race that allowed for a handling of conflict, not by imitation of the conflict, but by working in love, working in nonviolence, which he understood to be love. He translated sometime in his life, and I'm not sure whether it was early in the 20th century or in the 1920s when Albert Einstein was putting out his equation, but they're close proximity to each other. Where Gandhi, not having a word for what he was doing, decided to translate the Jainist word ahimsa, and he translated it into nonviolence, which he thought was the best way for his thinking and acting to go.
So what actually did you do in India to deepen your understanding of this teaching?
Well, I was an employee of the United Methodist Church Board of Missions. I was hired by Hislop College, a Presbyterian-founded college in Nagpur, in the geographical center of India, where I taught a class more than once in my 3 years on nonviolence, on the Bible, and did a lot of coaching of our Hislop teams, but then also through the YMCA, organized teams and try to help them develop what was for me a high school college understanding of sports, of football, of baseball, of basketball, and the like.
And then after your time in India, you came back to the States. You studied at Oberlin and Vanderbilt. And it was at Vanderbilt in Nashville that you began conducting seminars on nonviolence, in which you trained, as it were, many of the future leaders of the civil rights movement. So can you describe that period in your life?
Well, I have not really, and a lot of books I haven't read recently. So I'm not sure about all, I'm not willing to swear, but I can insist upon how Nashville got started. It was started because Nashville had a group of people who identified themselves with Martin Luther King Jr. and with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So we had a Nashville Christian Leadership Council that was an affiliate of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Dr. King. And we had people, clergy especially, who identified with the Montgomery bus boycott and with Martin King, who had emerged as the spokesperson. But also it's important to remember that he emerged as a primary voice for truth and justice of the United States in the world, because his life and work were all over magazines and papers in Africa and India, probably the rest of Asia.
When did you meet Dr. King?
I met Dr. King in my dreams, and in my pondering what I was going to be doing with what I was trying to do with my life. So by 1952, I had a profound sense that through nonviolence, we're going to challenge the emerging segregation in the United States. And I also acknowledge in that thinking, some of it was conscious study and reading, but others of it was when I was meditating, and some of it came out in the process of the night while sleeping. That by 1952, I knew we were going to have a nonviolent movement in the United States that would fight segregation and racism.
Were those revelations, Jim?
Yes, they were, because I organized my life around it. I saw it as a very deep calling from God through the prophet Jesus, and with the push of my father, but mostly my mother, I came to recognize that what Gandhi proposed was, in fact, the way Christians should act.
What part did your mother play in your formation?
Well, number one, just being who she was, my mother. But secondly, there were encounters with her that shaped my spirituality and my understanding of Jesus and my work. For example, in the spring summer of 1935, something like that, I came home from horseman school where I was in the 4th grade. And my mother immediately sent me uptown to run an errand. I don't remember what the errand was, but on Main Street, running my errand, I was accosted by a white youngster in a car parked on my side of the street. I was going east, and this car was parked on that side of the street. And a youngster sprang up in the driver's seat and yelled at me at least one or two racist epithets. And I walked over and I slapped the child, whose shoulders and arms and face were outside of the open window in the front seat of the car. And then I finished the errand, ran back home, reported the errand to my mother, who was in the kitchen busy, and then added to our conversation by telling her that I had met this episode of racism. I didn't use the term racism on the street, and that on that occasion I had therefore hit the person. I picked the fight to oppose that kind of experience. And my mother, without stopping what she was doing, simply said, when I finished, "Jimmy, what good did that do?" And then there was a soliloquy from her in which some of the major points of our lives, the church, Black people, and Jesus were all combined. But the message there is I was their son. I was being raised in the church, and that because of God and Jesus, there was no way in the world that I should imitate the kind of hostility I did face on that errand.
So that's a lesson you received early on in your life from your mother. And you then brought that, especially after your experience in India, to Nashville. And you offered training, workshops, seminars to the future leadership of the movement. You taught Diane Nash, James Bevel, Bernard Lafayette, John Lewis. What was it like to encounter these young activists in Nashville?
All right, I went south in 58 to begin working with the Fellowship of Reconciliation on the emerging movement that came out of Montgomery and out of the Supreme Court.
Brown v. Board of Education?
Yes, May 17th, 1954. That was an important moment for a lot of Black people in the United States, like the Little Rock Nine of Los Angeles. I met all of them. I knew all of them. And our first meeting, I helped them to understand what they were doing was a nonviolent approach, and that was rooted in baptism and rooted in Jesus of Nazareth and in the great exodus of people in what I insist upon calling now the Jewish Bible. So throughout that 59, 60, 70, and 1970, I was going into hot spots and helping people know how nonviolence was a powerful way to face violence and conflict.
At that time, did you have a sense of your place in history? Did you have a sense that you...
No, I really did not.
When did you understand that this movement was going to transform the United States?
Probably, I am quite sure, probably in 1952, I was aware of nonviolent struggle, of Gandhi, and I was conscientiously preparing myself to work in that budding movement. By 1958, we have the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King Jr., and we have the sit-in campaign, and the Freedom Ride, and the Mississippi Summer. All of these happened in the era of between 1954 and 1973.
And what was it like? How did you maintain your spirits in the face of violence, which was on many occasions the response to your nonviolence? And was there a moment at which you realized that the tide of history was with you and your comrades?
Well, frankly speaking, I was only once or twice the recipient of invisible attack or visible attack. And other than going to jails, in the campaign between 1958 and 1968 or 73, I never had a physical assault, neither by a crowd of white thugs or people resisting desegregation, or by any individual, or by the police, or by a police officer. And in that period of time, I was arrested and all. But again, I did not experience violence from our opponents personally. But I worked in college and after, and seminary, I worked on how I would react to behavioral violence, to a personal attack.
Meaning you trained yourself?
Yes, well, I'm not sure training is the best word, because I think really digging into Gandhi, really digging into the sit-ins that took place in Evanston, Illinois, and Los Angeles in the 50s, 40s, trying to figure out how they represented nonviolence and power was an important part of my study and reading. And we did not have internet, of course. We did not have podcasts, but we did have the Reader's Guide, which was a book put out by publishers of all the books and essays being published. It was called the Reader's Guide. And I could look in monthly issues and the annual issues, annual summary volume, and gain articles by John Swanley, by Bayard Rustin, by George Hauser, by Eleanor Roosevelt. and a host of other people. Some names I remember, many I don't, and some people I knew and others I did not know. But they were in various ways interpreting World War II, the occupation of the Nazis in Germany and France and Hungary, in nonviolent terms. That was especially true of A.J. Muste, the head of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. By 1947, 48, he had published a book called Pacifism, a Nonviolence in a Violent World.
Reverend Lawson, you believe in the virtue of the approach of nonviolence to this day.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
How does this work in our world today? Think of Russian aggression in Ukraine. Think of the convulsion of violence that we've just witnessed in Israel-Palestine. What does nonviolence teach us? How did the path of violence lead us to the position we're in, and how actually can nonviolence lead us to a different outcome?
Well, I think, number one, we human beings have to recognize that the use of violence the powers of violence. We are helping to increase the violence in our society and in the world. There must be a human break with the uses of violence. In the same way, there must be a break by the human race of the subjugation of women and the powers of being anti-woman and structuring our women are weak business into our society. There must be a break with those. There must be a break with using racism to subjugate people of color. There must be a break in the decision-making of the world and of the human race especially, that religious bigotry, especially anti-Semitism, because it's been the most violent entity of wrong in my own lifetime. I may not most violent from a point of view of religion, not from the point of view of the politics of racism, the politics of sexism, the politics of violence. But I would make both racism and sexism two of the powers that we have to break with and have to transform.
So I just want to think back to what was a successful example of marshaling the power and force of nonviolence, which is to say the civil rights movement. It achieved very tangible successes. It was able to consolidate a cohort of activists and leaders who are deeply committed to nonviolence. How did that happen? And have there been other successful examples subsequent to that of such a crystallization of the ideas and the human resources required to make nonviolence work? What was the magic of the period that was so formative in your life?
I maintain there is no magic. I maintain, number one, I was given a really invisible but visible imagery of my own life and the worth of my life. In fact, the sacredness of my life. This is hard to put. I mean, even though I think in so many different places in the Hebrew Bible and Christian Bibles, it's very clear that gift of God to us as God's children is the requirement of life in, major capital letters cover the earth.
Mm-hmm. But I want to go back to what was it in the late 50s and 60s that made this the most successful deployment of nonviolence, certainly in the history of the United States? Was it that you had the right people committed to the same idea and the right leadership that could bring people together? What were the conditions that were present there that we need to replicate in today's world?
Well, they are some of those issues are still here and among us. I mean, the emphasis upon, I'll say it the way the Jainists say it, sacredness of human life. There is a lot of that across the face of the world. There's a lot of it in all of the world religions, both in the poetry and the scriptures, and in the way some of the leadership across the earth talks. So there is a worldwide recognition that we human beings were birthed with peculiar participation in life and a consequence of a very real gift of life that we hardly can explain.
And yet so often we play out our interactions with other human beings through violence. It's become such a ubiquitous language. It's become the way you resolve disagreement or conflict. It's so present.
No, but I don't agree with it. Maybe I'm misunderstanding what I'm hearing. But in the emerging movement of nonviolence, I prefer the language of the late Congressman John Lewis, one of the people with whom I was in partnership and companionship in the Nashville campaign of 1959 and 60. John Lewis calls what we did the nonviolent movement of America. By that, he means a lot of stuff. Therefore, I continue to teach that freedom, civil rights movement is too big an issue to simply use it. We have to talk about the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. What the people did, how they functioned, what were the tactics of nonviolence that they used, what was their literature, how did they explain themselves? That includes Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and Louise West, Mary Jo Robinson, and Rosa Parks. How did they put on that campaign? And how was it nonviolence? It was nonviolent to the core.
How did they put on that campaign?
By trying to organize their struggle in ways that opposed a segregated Montgomery, Alabama, and a segregated bus company operating in Montgomery.
And when you look at the world today, when you look at the racism and the misogyny and the anti-Semitism and the Islamophobia and the anti-LGBTQ sentiments, and you see all the violence that's perpetrated in this country and abroad, do you lapse into despair?
No, I don't have despair about it. And I have experienced anguish. I have experienced danger, fragility in struggle, in campaigning. But I maintain that the Hebrew Christian scriptures for me demonstrate that you can resist that kind of world in the power of a Moses and in the power of a Jesus. The movement out of Egypt, described in the book of Exodus, represents a nonviolent approach to slavery. My forebears sang "Go Down Moses." I would love it if more I could. Of course, I can't. I can't hear and read everything or see all the films that are available, but I'm looking forward to the day when some Black musicians take "Go Down Moses" and write a new liturgy and update it to the continuing and future struggle of the human race. I don't know if that's been done or being done. I don't think it's being done as a deliberate artistic, spiritual, or musical push. But that "Go Down Moses," it seems to me, in my specific background, links the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible in saying evil must be resisted, must be opposed. And that a beginning place, by no means the only place, but the beginning place is with everyone who has inherited the gift of life by birth, has to do it for themselves within the context of their family and the people they pull together to work together. I don't see, for an example, today's newspaper where there were arrests of protesters at former Speaker Pelosi's home. I don't see that as a kind of tactic that is significant for building and strengthening the movement for freedom and justice. I simply don't see it. I think too many activists, even with this issue of Israel, Hamas, the Middle East, Northeastern Africa, I feel that too much of the activism is too little strategic thinking within the context of where they live, and also creating a strategic map for themselves that goes after specific measurable goals and pattern.
Like Montgomery, that's the template. Mm-hmm. That's the template for nonviolent justice.
Yes.
Is that larger strategic vision with specific nodal points that are sites of activism.
Yes, I think nonviolent resistance, nonviolent dismissing of the wrong and rejection of the wrong is critical. And I sometimes say that much of the activism in the United States can be and is in activism in vain, because they have not really done the wrestling with understanding their own situation and creating campaigns to change that situation.
How to effectively mobilize nonviolence to be as effective as possible. That's the goal, and that's what you think is missing often today.
Yes, I do. David, this is why I think the Nonviolent Movement of America by John Lewis is actually the way we should speak about it. It is a part of the nonviolent, of the civil rights movement. In 1866, a Republican Congress passed the first civil rights bill, to my knowledge. That bill said that everyone born in the United States is a citizen except the Indian. So it made all the slaves, former slaves, the children of slaves, citizens of the United States. And that's where I have found the first congressional act for the civil rights of all the people.
Right. And yet the exclusion of Native Americans reveals the incompleteness of it, which, of course, you would say is the reason why we need to continue to struggle and mobilize our energies in this way. And that leads me to my final question, which is, what do you see as the future of nonviolence in the United States and around the world? When you think of the next generation, are you optimistic about what the struggle for justice will look like?
I am sure that I cannot even begin to tackle that question. My major thesis in the 1900s, in the last 100 years and the present moment, is that we people who are concerned ought to adopt the 4-step way of organizing a campaign that I put in a little book called Nonviolence and Social Movements. I'll show this book. This is a book put out by the Labor Division of UCLA based on my teaching there the last 20 years with Kent Long. And I outline in that book, and then in a more recent book, Revolutionary Nonviolence, the 4 steps that I began to apply out of my college studies and historical studies leading up to my 1958 going and living in Nashville and working with Martin Luther King Jr. and the emerging nonviolent movement. There is an easy 4-step process. That 4-step process represents a USA conversation. It was going on in my college years and before. And I reduced it to 4.
What are the 4 steps?
The 4 steps of nonviolent action is, first of all, focus. And how I focused in Nashville, Tennessee in 58 was to do an inventory of all the problems facing the Black community. The gathering of a group that said we're going to desegregate Nashville. It's important to say they're not going to desegregate Washington, D.C., nor were they going to desegregate Northeast Africa. They were going to do it in their own locality. So focus. You can't do everything, but you can target your energy behind focus. The next step is to do the negotiating. Know who the opponents are and have some contact with them that helps them to see that you feel that some dismantling of the wrong has to be done. Then thirdly, the nonviolent direct action campaign. And it must be more than, it has to be more than one stroke. There are no one stroke movements and struggles. We do a march today we do a march today that calls for a ceasefire. Well, to make that happen means you have to mobilize and organize in many different ways. So the third step is this direct action. And then the fourth step is so important because we human beings, I think, and I mean in the United States of America, we have missed so many opportunities to help people who are in great, great, great turmoil and suffering to find their way to establish a stable community and a stable nation. We have done too little of that. And in my judgment, we've therefore prolonged the agony of too many people. Mississippi has an infant mortality rate that is comparable to any number of countries in South America, Africa, Asia. United States foreign policies, international policies, which has not worked on these issues of stability. And we say we're a good democracy, but it's not clear to me that we are an intentional democracy. In the very public places now, with Israel, Northeast Africa, Egypt, and with our own people in the United States, there are no significant voices that call us to end our violence in the United States as well as outside the United States. I would say that I would go so far as to say I don't know what Israel looks like these days, but I would say that the United States probably has not shown Israel the basis for stabilizing the North African area, the northeast part of Africa, and ending the violence. Because, among other things, in the last 10, 20 years, Russian mercenaries have moved into many places in Africa, which means an expansion of the suffering.
And so as you look at that map around the world, it leads one to conclude that violence is far outpacing nonviolence.
Oh, yes. Far too many people have decided that the powers of violence are more effective than the powers of compassion and love and truth. But as I read lightly, even now, on the situation in Northeast Africa, Palestine, Israel, Egypt,
the Middle East,
yes, that our domestic and international policies do not promote handling conflicts through democratic, just, beautiful tactics and ideologies. They're not at the forefront of many leaders.
Well, who can be the model exporter of nonviolence to the world? Where must that come from? And again, can it come from the United States?
Well, in my mind, that's a part of the phenomena of nonviolence. In 1955, Martin Luther King's voice became the worldwide voice for truth and justice and for dismantling the old order. And I remember some of the tensions and that created in the Black community, who gave this 25-year-old Black man from Montgomery the right to become the advocate of truth and justice around the world. That happened. I was living in India at that time. I saw it there. And I read the papers and magazines from the United States. It got to me 6 weeks or 2 months later. But his voice, and that came out of, I think, the way in which many human beings know that to make women and children suffer in Northeast Africa, because they do most of the suffering, to make them the major victims of our political struggles towards the promised land is a grave mistake, because it sows the seed of using more violence.
Well, on that note, and mindful of all that you have done over the course of your life to promote nonviolence, I want to thank you, Reverend James Lawson, for spending this time with us on Then and Now.
Thank you, David. I'm very pleased to be a part of you and a part of our Leonard Bierman Foundation and a part of the continuing struggle.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.